Hello, everyone. I'm Ginger Healy, and I want to welcome you to Building Family Resilience Through PATH. And PATH stands for Promoting Attachment and Trauma Healing. I'm going to do a really quick introduction of myself. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I work for the Attachment Trauma Network as the program director. I have worked in the schools as a school therapist and as a trauma therapist. But my most important job and role that I'm most proud of is being a mom to 4 children. I have one son that has been impacted by developmental trauma. He was adopted from a Romanian orphanage when he was almost 5 years old. And I have another son with autism. So these kids in my life really have taught me the most about my work and about what I do, and have really helped shape and form who I am and the work that I do. So grateful for all the experiences they have given me and continue to give me. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to do a brief foundational overview that shapes everything that I'm going to talk about. I know many of you may have already heard about ACEs, and so I don't need to go too deep into it, but I just want to explain that adverse childhood experiences is a term to describe the frequently occurring sources of stress that happen to children, from birth to 18 years of age, and what they might suffer in life. And they're grouped into 2 different categories: childhood maltreatment and neglect, and dysfunctional family environment. So physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence or violence in the home, living with alcohol or substance abuser, community violence. There are definitely more traumas than that can occur. These are the ones that I mentioned that were identified by the original study from Anda and Folletta. What's important is to know that this study reveals that when bad things happen to a child while they're developing and growing, they are at risk for major health problems and impairment in emotional, social, cognitive development. The higher the ACE score, the more likely that the child will have learning difficulties in school, as well as difficulties building relationships with others. But, in school settings, students who have experienced 3 or more ACEs, they have higher rates of academic failure, lower attendance, and more frequent behavior problems. So these ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, lead to long-term effects on the body. And they are very common. Despite age, race, gender, location, at least 64% of adults have had at least one adverse childhood experience. And we also learned from the ACE study that ACEs are interrelated. So even though they're, looked at or studied separately, if a sibling is in prison, that affects the child in the home. If a mother is beaten in the home, that affects everyone in the home. So incidents of abuse, they're never standalone events. And for each additional adverse experience, that toll later in life, that damage, it's increased. So it's important to know that the ACEs themselves, they're not a disorder or a diagnosis. It's risk factors for long-term problems. It's just a valid way to consider risk and evaluate the risk in these children that we care for. So if a child has that high ACE score and has experienced trauma, because of that, they are changed. That's what we're here to talk about. And because of that change, they require a different type of care. We need to parent them in a therapeutic manner, and they need therapeutic intervention. So the point of this slide is that no matter what age the child experiences things, no matter, what has happened, a child will carry the things that happened to them with them. Even a newborn infant, who may have experienced stress of a mother in the womb or fetal alcohol exposure to substances like alcohol and drugs. Those things, even though an infant may not be able to cognitively discuss that or remember, that infant carries that with them. These kids don't come to us as a blank slate. The body remembers, and it will result in trauma reactions from the child. So this slide just talks about things, other things also besides ACEs or ACEs that can contribute to this child's story. So there may have been chapters that have been written, but this story is not complete. So these ACEs that I mentioned are trauma or traumas that have happened to the child. And there are many, many different kinds of trauma: complex, acute, generational, collective. That's something we have experienced through COVID is collective trauma, chronic pervasive trauma, vicarious trauma, toxic stress. What I'm going to focus on today is that developmental trauma, those adverse childhood experiences that happen when a child is growing and developing. So let's look at this definition. Dr. Bruce Perry has defined trauma as an event that is outside normal human experience or a pattern of experiences that impairs, the proper functioning of a person's stress response system, and that makes it more reactive or sensitive. So it's in how the person experiences or perceives what happened to them. So what is traumatizing to one person or one child may not be traumatizing to the other. You can have two people in the same car accident or two children in the home experiencing the witnessing of the same domestic violence incident, but that does not mean that they will have the exact same results or understand or perceive it the same. It's different for everyone. There are three things you need to be aware of with trauma, and that's event, experience, and effect. And that is going to be different for everyone. So trauma isn't just the bad things that happen to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. It's how your body and your nervous system responds to that event or to that experience. Trauma is not a mental illness, it's a mental injury, and it can be healed. So this is where I want to talk about our stress response system, because we all experience stress, and not all stress is bad. There is positive stress. We have to experience healthy levels of stress in order to grow and to thrive. Positive stress gets us out of bed in the morning because we have a deadline to meet, we have a job to get to, we have school, and so that motivates us. That's the positive stress. And then there is tolerable stress. And that is stress that gets buffered by relationships. It helps us grow and become more resilient because we can tolerate it. It's tolerable. And then there is toxic stress, and that is extreme and frequent or extended activation. The stress doesn't stop. We don't get reprieve from it. And if there's no buffer there, no adult to help the child combat that stress or relieve that stress, then it results in overwhelm. It just becomes too much. And that can happen when there's isolation, lack of support. That long-term toxic stress is very damaging and very harmful. It actually changes the structure and functioning of the child's developing brain. And that's why we really want to talk about how important it is to recognize and to buffer stress so that it does not become toxic. So when that child detects danger or senses threat and it is not relieved, it just becomes toxic because that nervous system releases those stressed hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, in order to help the child. But when the stress doesn't stop and those stress hormones continue to be dumped, it actually becomes toxic. It's poison. I've heard it equated to dumping battery acid on a child's brain, which is a very painful thing to think about. But that is a visual that helps us understand how serious stress can become if it is not alleviated. So it also helps explain children who are experiencing this are constantly in that fight, flight, freeze mode, always in survival mode, and how dangerous it is. It actually shortens lifespans. And the thing is, too, that it's different for everyone. What is tolerable to one person may be intolerable to another. And so children who are overly sensitive or that have become overwhelmed, the smallest thing can actually trigger that response system, and they can detect threat when even there is not danger around, but those stress hormones will be dumped into their system because they perceive there is a threat, and it becomes toxic. So that's kind of referred to also as our window of tolerance, because on both sides, you know, if we're hypo-aroused, that stress can be intolerable. And if we're hyper-aroused, it can become intolerable. So you've got both ends of those windows. And a window wide open, that's that hyper-arousal, but a window shut down, that's the hypo-arousal. In the middle is where we want to be, where the stress is tolerable, and of course, the positive stress as well. That's when, like, you know, we're going along in our day and everything's going really smoothly. We're open, we're curious, we're present, we're attuned. It's when we feel safe. It's when that child feels safe. That's when that stress is positive and tolerable, and when they're in that optimal zone for the window of tolerance. The good news is that window can be widened. There are activities that help us regulate and teach us how to self-regulate. And those are the same activities, you know, that we use to widen our window and to teach regulation. Things like mindfulness, reducing shame, increasing happiness, and building resilience. And we're going to talk more about those things as we move along here, but it's important to know what we're looking about and what we're looking at and talking about. So this is where I want to spend some time on trauma reactions, really understanding what it looks like, and the danger in the labels that we place on children when we don't understand that their behavior is a function of self-protection and a trauma reaction. So let's talk really quickly about fight. Fight would be, you know, those tempers, those outbursts, aggression, exhibiting control, demanding perfection, bully behavior, criticizing, yelling, swearing, right? But this list that I have on the screen are the labels that children receive when they exhibit those fight behaviors. We hear children being called stubborn, right? And that they are the type of child who just always wants to challenge authority. So I want you to think about labels versus the actual trauma reaction. Let's move to flight. This is someone who, or a child who is constantly staying busy and always on the go. They're full of worry. They may hide, run away, escape, always want to go to the nurse's office, or go to the bathroom and not be able to stay in class. That's that flight. But what often happens is they get labeled as avoiding or seeking attention, or they're hyperactive, they're constantly distracted. Those negative labels that we place if we don't understand that it's actually a flight behavior. And then let's talk about freeze. So this the behavior might look like someone who's confused, struggling with making decisions. You know, if you ask a child a question and they give you that blank stare, they look like they're deer in the headlights, or they say, I don't know. When you know that they actually do know, but they say, I don't know, that is a freeze response. It could also be isolation, feeling detached, feeling stuck, but oftentimes these children are labeled as daydreamers, children who are lazy, that they don't apply themselves, they don't care, they don't even try. So it's a different way of looking at what's really going on. I want to talk to you about another trauma response called fawning. You may not have heard this one before, but this is a child who is unable to stand up for themselves. They may lack boundaries. They avoid conflict at all costs. They're extremely concerned about fitting in. And so they are not able to say no or set boundaries. They will defer to someone else. But these are children who are labeled as attention seeking, people pleasing, flattering. They look to others for cues. They defer so that others can dictate their behavior. They are often termed as just followers, but they're very vulnerable, and also labeled as codependent. So it's something we need to be aware of, because I'm sure as I was describing this, you were starting to picture children in your head who exhibit this behavior. And now that you know that this is a trauma response, I'm hoping that you will look at these children in a different way, because these labels that are placed on these children is not who they truly are. These are symptoms of trauma. And often children will display these behaviors when something has triggered them. And it could be something that is happening in the present moment, or it could be something that happened very long ago. Soon I'm going to be talking to you about what the brain does, and I'm going to introduce you to the hippocampus, who has a hard time distinguishing between past and present, because it's grown big and strong and now malfunctions as a result of trauma. And so it could be that this child is doing something that did not happen in the present, but they were triggered by something in the past, and now they are confused about if there really is threat or danger. They perceive it even though it might not be there. So we don't always know what the trigger is. We have to take that focus off the behaviors and understand that it is a trauma response. So they're just protective behaviors that happen, of course, when there is danger or perceived danger, and they need to protect themselves. So oftentimes they are triggered by fear and shame. I want to show you this iceberg. It's an important graphic to show that on top of the iceberg, the part that we see does not show the entirety of what is going on. We see the behaviors, right? We see all the things that people automatically want to consequence. But what I want you to know is that there is so much going on underneath the iceberg. And when you look beneath the surface and get very curious and become a detective and try to figure out what's going on, this is what you'll often find below the surface, that the child isn't actually really angry. It may be that they're afraid and feel unsafe. So they need to display anger in order to protect themselves. Or it may be that we see lying, and a lot of parents and teachers and whoever is caring for the child want to consequence lying. But if you look underneath and determine why the child is lying, it could be that they are afraid, they are worried about being rejected, so they brag about something or lie about something, but they feel the need to protect themselves and not say the truth, because the truth is very scary if it may result in a consequence, which is similar to self-sabotaging, right? Because they may receive a consequence either way. But our consequences that we impose on children would probably be very different if we understood why they were doing what they were doing. If we understood that the child was scared, we would probably respond very differently than if we automatically felt angry and triggered by a child who lies to us and pushes our buttons and repeats behavior that we've previously told them to stop. So I'm hoping that we also learn to use the word consequence in a different way or respond in a different way. But I want you, when you think about this iceberg and see the behaviors on top, start asking questions. Has the child experienced things adversely in their past that may have caused this behavior? Does the child have a disability or a learning disability and the needs aren't being accommodated, and so they are accommodating them themselves? I'll think of it later. They're doing things differently in order to cover up what's really going on. Does the child have the skills to meet the demands we are imposing? Are our expectations for the child unrealistic, and therefore they're compensate? That's the word I was trying to think of. Are they compensating for something that they are not able to do? What we consider something they won't do willfully could be something that they actually cannot do, and so they have to compensate for it. Is the child regulated? Often, if what we're seeing above the iceberg are these behaviors, then the child is dysregulated. So the behaviors will stop if we regulate them. So there could be a lot of things that if we ask, then we will look at it in a different way. But we have to look underneath, because if we don't, then oftentimes we react instead of responding. And then we end up re-traumatizing the child. And what happens oftentimes is that when we don't understand what's going on underneath the iceberg, these children are misunderstood, mislabeled, mistreated. They are misdiagnosed. And here I have a list of diagnoses that may or may not be happening with the child. But I want us to take a second look at these, because if there is a child who exhibits ADHD symptoms but is not responding to ADHD medication, they're likely misdiagnosed. Oppositional defiant disorder is one that some will argue does not even actually exist, and so it often gets misdiagnosed. So I just want you to think about, is this a true diagnosis, or are we mislabeling the child because we're not actually understanding what the behaviors are trying to tell us, what's really going on? Because a psychiatric diagnosis has extreme consequences, right? It informs how we're going to respond, what treatment we can be, and incorrect treatment and medication can have really scary consequences, and labels can follow a child through their life and really harm them as well if they're not accurate, So I understand that we are forced to diagnose children for billing purposes. That's a whole other conversation. But I just want our responses to these children to be heavily examined so that we treat them in the way that truly focuses on how we can help them heal. So these diagnoses, they just don't clarify what's actually wrong with the child. We need to correctly define what's going on with them so that we're not just trying to use medication or other things to stop behavior. And so I want us to talk about shifting our paradigm, looking at kids in a completely different way than we may have looked at them before, and change the way we think about their behaviors, understanding that what they are doing is trying to communicate something that they may not be able to communicate verbally to us when we ask them, why did you do that? Why are you doing that again? And they look at you deer in the headlights, or they say, I don't know, and then we become more angry. What if we backed up and looked underneath the iceberg and understood that for whatever reason, this child was very scared, or they really felt unworthy, and so they acted out in this other way. Those reactions, especially the overreactions, the fight ones that we see, they have a neurobiological basis. And oftentimes our expectations are not able to be met by the child. And if we look at the child and become frustrated because we feel that they won't do what we ask them to do, then we're not understanding that they actually can't. When their lid is flipped and their nervous system is activated and they are triggered, many things happen biologically that cause them not to be able to meet our expectations. I'm going to explain that in a minute when I talk about the hand-brain model, but I want you to keep that in the back of your mind: can't versus won't, and the shifting of our expectations. So one thing that's not listed here, but that I want to mention and not forget, is that it's really important for us to look at these children and parent them. If we're the caregiver, or if we're the teacher, teach them, or if we're, the therapist, work with them at their developmental age, not their chronological age. Even though the child might be chronologically 10 years old, look 10 years old, if they have been impacted by trauma, then developmentally they are much younger than a 10-year-old. And you would ask different things of a 3-year-old than a 10-year-old. So if you're going to look at the 10-year-old, you have to kind of shift your lens and look at them much younger, possibly a 3, 4, 5-year-old, and then modify your expectations and what you're asking them to something they can do rather than something they can't do. So we're going to talk about neuroplasticity and the hope that that brings, that we can change and rewire their brains. And we're going to do that by talking about some brain tenets, some basic brain tenets. And the first one is that the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. I want you to look at this picture of this baby. He looks like a baby banker, but is he a banker? No, he is not a banker. He's too young to be a banker. His brain has not formed enough to be a banker. He cannot do what a banker does in his 9 to 5 work days. So I want you to think about children impacted by trauma and understand that they cannot do something that they are not biologically, emotionally, physically, and developmentally ready to do. We have to understand how brains form, when they form, to really understand what a child can do. And once you understand what a child can do, then you ask a child, to do things that they are able to accomplish rather than what they are not able to accomplish. So a child has to go through those developmental stages. They really can't be skipped. Missed steps or skipped steps in developmental struggles cause problems in development, right? And so it results in a lot of different struggles. We're going to dive into a few of them, like processing and executive functioning and all of that. That executive functioning, it doesn't come online until adulthood, well into adulthood. And so if we're asking a child to do a lot of things that require executive functioning skills, then we are setting the child up for failure. So we have to be aware of that. If the child is dysregulated, and children who are impacted by trauma are very often dysregulated, they often spend more time dysregulated than regulated, that means that there are gaps in their development. That's why they're dysregulated, is this missed steps and gaps And so we have to fill in those gaps and rewire the brain. We're going to talk about that. But it means that these kids haven't hit certain milestones yet that maybe other children their age have. And so they're just not ready yet. They look like they're ready, but they're not. So let's talk about number 2, which is use it or lose it. What this means is that what gets used in the brain gets strengthened, and what does not get used gets pruned away. That picture is of pruning shears to remind us that if we don't use certain parts of our brain, it gets pruned away. This explains why some things work really well in this child's brain who's been impacted by trauma and other things don't work at all. So I like to use the example of when we go to the gym. If we were to pump our biceps all day, our biceps would get really big and really strong. But what would happen to our legs? They would not get strong at all. They'd become very weak, and there would be quite an imbalance in our body, right? The same thing happens with the brain. What gets used in the brain gets really big and strong, but the parts of the brain that don't get used, that get neglected, if a child is neglected or abused, then things are underactivated in the brain. So I'm going to talk a little more about that. Let me just say, we know this because of MRI scans. We have seen in many children's MRI scans parts of the brain that are firing and really highly activated, and then the spots that are just dull and have been pruned away and are not firing. So abuse creates a very strong limbic system in the brain. And I'm going to show you and demonstrate where the limbic system is and what it is in just a minute. But for now, I want you to know that the part of the brain that gets really overactivated when a child is abused is the limbic system, where the amygdala and the hippocampus is. And so what that means is that that's your threat detection system. So that's why a child who has had trauma is very hypervigilant. They detect threat everywhere, even when there isn't a threat, even when the threat has gone, they still feel the threat is there. So they're very oversensitive with triggers. They fly off the handle at the smallest thing or something that they shouldn't have, because that amygdala has become very big and very strong and fires at the drop of a hat. And so these are kids that approach everything from a fear-based expectation. They mistrust everything, and they constantly shut down because they don't have the part of the brain firing that teaches them how to self-regulate and calm and modulate and transition and adjust. That part has been pruned away because it hasn't been used. The only thing that's been really used is that threat detection system. Because of the constant abuse, they feel very unsafe. That's the only thing working. So they live in that threat detection system. Let's talk about number 3. And it's similar. What fires together, wires together. So you see this picture of the little girl who is very sad. And then you see the picture of the other girl who is very calm. One side for this one little girl is very wired and strong, living in chaos all the time. You've seen those kids who it seems like there's just constant drama, constant chaos. They cry all the time, or they never cry. It's because they have been wired to do that, and it's become very strong. The good news is that we can rewire to this other side where a child can feel calm and feel peace, and when the tough times come, they can modulate that and handle that and deal with that. So our brain is a supercomputer, right? With neurons and pathways that are like wires. And the brain wants to be really efficient. And so it wires things together when it sees a pattern. So if there's a pattern in the home of yelling or of abuse, and I don't just mean in the home. I hope that you're understanding I'm not just harping on homes. Abuse and neglect and adverse childhood experiences can happen anywhere, not just the home. I'm using the home as an example. And so wherever, say this child has been abused or witnessed domestic violence, and this has happened over and over again, that's a pattern within the home or wherever it happens, that becomes wired in the child's brain. So when adverse childhood experiences happen over and over and over again, the brain establishes that pattern, wires it together, and of course it's wired in a negative way. So, and we know this through MRI. So let's talk about an example of driving a car. When you first learned how to drive a car, it took a while, right? You had to practice it. You had to think about every little step. You got in the car, you put on the seatbelt, you checked your blind spot, you turned on the ignition, you know, and then everything took a little bit longer because you had to think about every little step. But after you've been driving many years, oftentimes you get in the car and you start driving, and then all of a sudden you're at your destination and you're like, oh, I don't even remember how I got here. I was listening to my Audible book and thinking about something else. I did not think about, okay, a stop sign's coming up. I should apply pressure to the brake. Now I need, we don't think about every little step because it has become wired and our brain's very efficient. And so it found the pattern of driving the car, and we don't have to think about every little step. It's already wired in there. So let's think about relationships. A common one for children impacted by trauma is that they may have suffered neglect. And if that's the case, they may have it wired in that a primary caregiver is unsafe. Which means that it's possible that every time now they meet a new primary caregiver, like at a daycare or a new foster parent or a teacher at school, they automatically distrust that person because it is wired into them that that person is not to be trusted, is going to abandon them or neglect them and not meet their needs. So if you're a new foster parent, I hear this all often, that the foster parent is so excited for the child to come into their safe home and everything's going to go smooth after that. But oftentimes, I'm laughing because I know that many of you probably went, oh yeah, right. You know the truth. The truth is that a child may come into that new foster home, and even though the new foster mom is safe and the new home is safe, the child does not feel safe because it's wired in that any new experience, any primary caregiver is going to neglect me. The good news is that we can rewire what has become chaos and wired for chaos. We can rewire to the calm. It's contagious. Just as these kids come into the home and it can be, their chaos can be contagious, our calm can be contagious. So we have to teach and model that. And for traumatized children, it can take a long time, but there's so much hope in the neuroplasticity of it all. And that's what I want to talk about next, because up until the 1960s, mental health professionals and researchers believed that once we reach adulthood, our brain didn't change. It was wired and fixed the way it was. So it was thought that wherever we were in that brain was permanent and could not be changed. But luckily, we know now research has proved otherwise. We know now that neural connections are pathways in the brain that are formed with experiences. And we as humans have new experiences every day. So what that means is that the positive experiences can rewire the brain to positive. The negative can wire it to negative. So then the answer becomes we create new experiences as often as we can, and positive ones, in order to kind of shape and rewire. Every time that we experience something new, a new neural pathway is formed. And if repeated, then that reinforces and strengthens connections between those brain cells. It's just like a trail, a hiking trail. The more we use it, the more worn it gets. And it can go, positive or negative. Once it goes negative, that's when depression and anxiety and those neural pathways really get strong, leading the way for like addiction and things to numb that pain. But repeated positive experiences create reinforced pathway construction towards like healing and self-regulation and all of those things. So what I'm going to do next is stop sharing my screen for a minute so I can teach you the hand-brain model. I'm going to take a quick drink. And this is something that you can teach very young children. It gives them a language, a common language, so that everyone can be on the same page. So your hand is going to become a model of the brain. This is your brain stem, the bottom part of your brain, and your cerebellum right here. This is the part that's, digestion, breathing, things that we don't think about that just happen automatically. And then this is your midbrain. So the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. So this is what happens first and happens automatically. Everybody has it. And then this comes next. And then up here is your cortex. And right here is your prefrontal cortex. And that comes online very last, like not fully until adulthood. It continues to form. So let's go back to this part right here, this midbrain. This is your limbic system. And right here, your hippocampus. And then you fold your thumb over and that's your amygdala. And so this is what I had referred to prior as like your stress response system, your alarm system, your threat detection system. So this is what becomes really big and strong. If there is threat and there is danger, it gets used and becomes really strong. It becomes an expert at growth and gets really, really, it fires more often than it needs to. It is constantly searching for threat and danger. That's that hypervigilance. So this is what we want the brain to look like: calm, cozy, safe, able to be curious. This is what it looks like when we're in that prefrontal cortex and we're safe and we're regulated. This is what it looks like when we are dysregulated. So if you are driving in your car and the car in front of you slams on its brakes, then this part goes, oh, is there danger? And your lid starts to flip. And if the car in front of you, if you're able to stop in time, then you go, oh, I don't need to worry, I'm safe, I did not crash, and the lid goes back down. If you crash the car, the lid flips, right? And we become dysregulated. Now in children, what happens is if they're in the car or in the classroom and the teacher says, we're going to have a pop quiz, then the threat detection goes, oh, danger, danger, I haven't studied, or I'm scared, or I can't remember anything, or I'm stupid, I hate myself, I knew I'm going to fail this test, I'm unworthy, so I better protect myself. Teacher, I have to go to the bathroom. Teacher, I have to, whatever the lie is, fight, flight, freeze, or start throwing books. It can look like so many different things, or shut down. And the teacher says, we're going to take the quiz. What's wrong with you? Get out your pencil. Deer in the headlights. Can look like a lot of different things. So our goal, when this happens, when that lid starts to flip, our goal as the adults is to help the child recognize what's happening, co-regulate with them, and get that lid down so that they can be in their prefrontal cortex. Because They can take the test in their prefrontal cortex. They cannot take it when the lid is flipped. Whatever we're asking them, they cannot do if the lid is flipped. This is when we can ask questions. So a lecture does no good. Yelling at the child does no good when their lid is flipped because they can't hear it, because their processing system's up here. And when the lid is flipped, the ears cannot process sound, the vision, everything goes offline, right? So this is the goal. And so it's just important to know that and to teach kids. You can teach kids very little that this is green, this is yellow, this is red. That gives them a language that you can say, you look like you're a little worried right now. Are you feeling yellow? Or I can tell you're red right now. Let's go take a break. Let's get you what you need. And kids in the classroom can say, Johnny looks yellow, I'm worried about him. Or I can tell that Johnny's red right now, let's give him space, or let's have empathy for him. So a lot of different ways to handle this hand-brain model, but it gives a common language. It takes the shame out of misbehaviors because everybody flips their lid. I think I flipped my lid 3 times today because we ran out of milk. The car was out of gas. It happens every day, but it's not the flipping of the lid, it's getting the lid back down again. That's important, and modeling that for children. And so we can say, I flipped my lid today. I was scared because there was a problem. And then a child goes, oh, it's okay to flip my lid. It happens every day. It takes the shame out of it. So it's just important to teach them how their brain works, because then it's not them that's bad, it's the nervous system, it's the brain that's struggling. Let's help that. So it takes fear and shame out of it, and it makes it common language, and it just brings safety to the relationship. And it's just important that kids that they're aware of the part of the brain that takes over when they're upset, and the part of the brain that's accessible when they're calm. It teaches them to talk about where their brain's at and what they're feeling. It's just an important first step in getting regulated, is that awareness and that understanding, and it rewires the brain. It helps those neurological loops make connections that are needed in order to strengthen that self-control. That's how you strengthen it, is to use it or lose it, right? So I just want to quickly, as I'm going back to sharing my screen again, talk a little bit about executive function, because it's so important when we're talking about our expectations for a child, that we understand what executive function is, and when it comes online. It's the area, that part of the brain that I talked about. It doesn't fully come online until adulthood. It's where we process information, self-control, self-regulation, pattern thinking, processing, where we have that flexibility emotionally. We're flexible, adaptant, coherent, energized, and stable. And so that part takes a long time. And so if we're asking kids to do what that prefrontal cortex does, what that executive functioning does, and it hasn't been developed yet, then we're setting up that child for failure. But we can strengthen it, we can use it. The more often we use it, the stronger it becomes. And so we have to exercise it, and that's what we can do as adults. So I want to next talk about attachment, because early attachment really plays a lifelong role in human adaptation. How loved you felt as a child is really a great predictor of how you manage all kinds of difficult situations later in life. Babies are born into this world completely helpless, completely dependent on the caregivers, who are ready to connect with them. They need an adult to survive, right? So they come oftentimes attuned to the person that carried them in their womb for 9 months prior. And anytime that early attachment cycle is broken, such as through that loss of that original caretaker, that's traumatic. So if you think about adoption, if that child was removed from that caretaker as an infant, that is a loss, even though that might be the absolute best thing for that child, or that it was there was no other way around it. If that caregiver died, for whatever reason, that break in the attachment cycle happens, it is traumatic. Take a drink. So even though that infant might not remember that, they carry it with them. It still affects them, because that's when that child is growing and developing, that's when your worldviews and your self views, all of that is being determined and developed. And those beliefs start weighing in. So when that trauma happens at a very early age, it shapes your worldview and your self view. And then, of course, behaviors result. That's why it's important to understand this attachment cycle and understand why developmental trauma is so unique, and what happens when this child is growing and developing at such a young age. So when a baby's born, they have a need, they cry to express that need, and then the caregiver meets the need. And because the caregiver meets the need, the infant trusts the caregiver because they are seen and heard. And this cycle repeats a million times a day. And then trust is developed, and the infant learns that if I make my needs known, someone will come alongside of me and help me. It forms this base underlying belief that if I'm scared, someone will have my best interest at heart and help me. If I'm helpless, then someone will help me. Okay, so that's what happens in a safe, normal, secure attachment cycle. But what happens if this normal attachment cycle is not met? If the baby has a need and the baby cries, but the needs are not met, what happens? Mistrust happens, which leads to this child feeling and internalizing that the world is unsafe, that it's scary, that it's unpredictable, that adults can't be trusted, that they don't matter, that they can only depend on themselves. So understanding that brain development and that attachment cycle and how trauma impacts us helps us to understand this deep depth of harm that has happened to these children from their early loss and grief and abandonment and trauma. The good news, the really good news, is that we can heal these children. So I want to talk a little bit about resilience. It's the science of hope and the greatest predictor of success in human life. And so what is it? It's the ability to overcome hardships, to bounce back, and to spring forward. The important thing to know here is that we aren't born resilient. We are born dependent. So resilience requires relationship, not rugged individualism. So we have to build that resilience, scaffold it. And how do we do that? This is a picture from the Harvard Center for Child Development, and it shows that it's really actually a simple drawing, that if a child has had a lot of negative experiences and the fulcrum is really heavy on that side, the way to shift it is to add in positive experiences. It's very simple, right? But it's something that really helps me visualize what we need to keep doing with children, is adding to the positive so that we can alleviate the negative experiences, those adverse childhood experiences. So things like safety, nurture, security, protective relationships, that's the positive experiences and outcomes that I'm talking about, that we have to outweigh those negative, those cumulative impacts of the positive give children more coping skills. And then it gets easier and better. It's rewiring so that those patterns get wired in. What we use gets stronger, right? And what we don't use gets weaker. So resilience really helps us get over trauma. And it's how we heal. We heal through relationships. So Dr. Jack Schoenkoff here from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child says that the most significant determinant of resilience is the quality of our close personal relationships, right? It just takes one stable, committed relationship from a supportive parent, caregiver, or another adult. It is so nice if we have the whole village, and so important if we have more than one, but it only takes one. And you can be that supportive caregiver adult in that child to build that resilience. Good enough parenting, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just meet those basic requirements we're going to talk about. We only have to get it right 30% of the time. And that good enough parenting will equal secure attachment. And attachment equals resilience. So attachment really is the antidote here. So I want to move into this therapeutic parenting that we've been alluding to. Therapeutic parenting is trauma-informed, attachment-focused caregiving. It's an approach for families whose children have really been impacted by trauma and those early adversities. It aids in the development of those new neural pathways of trust. And it just really describes parenting that is focused on high structure, high nurture, to foster those feelings of safety and connectedness so that that traumatized child can heal and attach. Empathy is at the core, and learning to parent therapeutically is really the single most important thing that we can do to help children. It's so much more powerful than just 1 hour a week in a therapist office, right? Because it's 24/7 in the home. So no matter what role you play, we can promote this and educate and teach and model it. So let's talk about the essentials of path parenting, which is from the Attachment and Trauma Network. We're going to talk about safety, high structure, high nurture, getting regulated, staying connected, and being intentional. The order doesn't matter except the first one, which is safety. Safety always has to come first. Or if there's not safety in the home or felt safety in the classroom, in the therapist office, in the residential treatment center, then nothing else really matters. So that's why we always start with safety. And we're talking about everyone in the home, everyone around must feel safe. But even more than that, we're talking about everyone must feel safe. The difference there is that even though a child might be in a physically safe environment, they may not feel safe. It might not have been internalized yet. So we have to create that safety for them. And so we do that by creating holding spaces for emotion. We don't judge the emotion, we accept it. We don't try to automatically just squash and stop the behaviors. We have to sit back and try to figure out where those are coming from. What's the feeling behind it? So it's emotional and mental safety. It's accepting those feelings without judgment and then reflecting those feelings back. We do that through avoiding sarcasm, because that use of sarcasm and the tone, volume, language, cadence of our voice can really make a child feel unsafe, depending on what is being said, how loud it is being said. Sarcasm can be very hurtful and confusing. So we have to reflect the feelings back to the child and help them feel seen and safe. And that comes through attunement to their needs and to their feelings. And we can also do that through announcing transitions and plans, helping them be involved in plans so that they can anticipate, change. So it's just really important to identify those triggers that come up and shift our expectations based upon their needs. And the biggest way that we can create safety is through high structure and high nurture. We have to have both. We can't be too permissive or too punitive. We have to be extremely structured through boundaries, but the boundaries need to be loving. And routines really make a big impact there too. So predictability, routines, care around transitions, as I had mentioned, keeping their world small, not introducing too many people or too many activities because they get so easily, quickly overwhelmed. And I also did mention before about safe body language and communication. It's about finding that balance between firmness and softness, and it can be a challenge. I really understand that, but attempting to do that so that that predictability feels safe and comforting. So setting limits and boundaries around actions, but remaining connected, not, time ins versus time outs. All of that, waiting to talk to them until their lid is down rather than giving directions and, lectures and things like that when their lid is flipped. All right, let's talk about regulation. It's the ability to manage emotions. It's the skills that we use to calm those stress response systems in our body. It gives us flexibility through self-soothing. It's the modulation rather than the elimination of the emotions, because we want the child to be accepted and feel comfortable. So it's like we're healing instead of fixing, if that makes sense. So the first step is that we need to, as the adult or caregiver, be calm ourselves and then stay in that calm zone, which is way more easy, right? Easily stated than done. But we cannot calm a child if we are not calm ourselves. If we're yelling and screaming and really frustrated and angered, that is not the time to be with the child, because that chaos is contagious. We want to be calm so that our calm can be contagious. So that's the first step. And then the second one is co-regulation. These children are not able to self-regulate. So we first regulate ourselves and then co-regulate the child. And then eventually they'll be able to regulate on their own. But co-regulation is everything. And there's different ways we can do that, but we have to be present and attuned, or we cannot understand and be with them and expect them to change the behavior if we're not doing this side by side with them and making them feel safe. We have to support them and be present so that we can reflect back calm to them. So it's a physical presence, but it's also an emotional presence as well. And we hold space, meaning we allow those feelings to happen without judgment. We don't yell for them to stop and shame them for having that behavior. We have to sit with that behavior and understand where it came from so that we can get to the root of it. And there's lots of different ways to do that, to actively teach that through the co-regulation process. And we can do it through breathing, through mindfulness. Movement is a very important part of this, especially when a child is hypoaroused and stuck in that freeze response. We want to get them moving in a safe way, so giving them sensory input. Sometimes they need weight, or my son, he immediately needs to he gets hot, and so we take off his socks and take off his shirt and try to cool him down. So it depends on the child and it depends on the situation, but there is a lot of great ways to teach self-regulation that we don't have time to go into now, but regulation tools, there are many. I want to move on to connection. Connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen and heard and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from relationship. That's from Brene Brown. But I want you to take a look at these little otters that are holding hands. That's called rafting, and they do that so that they don't get lost. They stay connected and hold on to each other. And so developing that strong connection really helps us understand what our child's behavior is communicating. It helps our children find other healthy ways to communicate those negative feelings. And it really just focuses on relationships. We've got to take the focus off of the behaviors in order to stay connected by showing them that the relationship matters. The relationship comes first. I will continue to love you and accept you and be with you no matter what awful, difficult, maladaptive behavior you're expressing, because the behaviors will take care of themselves once that child feels safe and is regulated and is connected with that buffer relationship. So I think that as therapeutic parents, we often, the goal for therapeutic parents is to really see behaviors as signs and symptoms. So if we can use this PACE model from Dr. Dan Hughes, that will give you cues on what to do next. So the remaining playful, keeping it light, really shifts the child out of that stuck, frustrated behavior, that environment of safe, fun play is so important. And it really just diffuses difficult situations, and it's where we have to really kind of let things go and pick and choose battles. But play, it changes the brain. It relaxes us so that we can heal. And that's how we rewire, is through those play. It's a child's work. It's how we rewire the brain. Acceptance is next, and that's where you're going to hold that non-judgmental space for those feelings. And then, of course, curiosity, I've alluded to a lot, where we try to become a detective and figure out what's really going on. And then empathy, where we remember, what's that something has brought us to where we are today, right? This child is in our home for a reason. If we are a foster parent, something happened to this child. If we're in a residential treatment center, something happened to this child. And so we have to understand the depth of harm that has occurred, so that we can help them feel felt and feel seen, and really reflect that back to them. That's that empathy piece. And then being intentional. So that's therapeutic parenting has a plan. This father penguin sits on the egg for like 60 days and is very intentional about how to protect this child. So fathers are a big, important piece of this as well. It's not about, just flying by the seat of our pants. We have to really be intentional and parent with a purpose and have a plan. Okay, so I want to kind of end with talking about ourselves as caregivers, because it's really the most important piece. These kids have to have this strong, stable, safe adult to co-regulate in order to be resilient. And we can't just do that without taking care of ourselves, because therapeutic parenting is really hard, right? Really draining, and we need a lot of things. We cannot do it alone. First of all, we kind of have to deal with our own stuff, our own triggers and our own baggage, because these kids will push buttons in us that we may not even know we had. It is like, speaking as a parent of a child who has experienced trauma, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. And it brought out a lot of things that I needed to deal with on my own so that I was strong enough to help him. So we have to help ourselves first. And if there are things that are preventing us, then we have to really do the hard work ourselves and receive therapy for ourselves to work through things. Because oftentimes we make the mistake of just kind of keeping going and continuing to be drained and trying to be strong on our own, but that's when we get overwhelmed and burn out. So we have to have a support system, especially if ourselves as caregivers have had a high ACE score ourselves. So we don't want to, end up with compassion fatigue and burnout, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. We have seen it all in this line of work. So that supportive community care is really critical. And when I say self-care, I really also mean community care, because we cannot do this alone. It's too much. So oftentimes we get drained in this work because these kids aren't able to give back. It's not necessarily a reciprocal relationship. We have to give without having our own cups filled by that relationship with that child. And so we have to find other ways for our cup to be filled. We have to be really intentional about this. So first of all, we have to adjust our own expectations. Instead of thinking that we were going to be that fun soccer mom, oftentimes we find that we become first responders to crisis. And a lot of these homes, foster homes and classrooms and RTCs and adoptive homes become crisis all the time. And we find that we're first responders. And in order to be a first responder, what do you have to have? Training, support, acceptance of your new job description. You're no longer, the fun soccer mom, you're a healer and a trauma worker. And those healers and advocates and trauma workers, EMTs, they have a lot of education and support and equipment. So you have to think of yourself that way so that you can buoy yourself up with all of that as well, right? You have to have access to help, equipment, training, a team, respite care, break, from the front lines. You have to have a chance to process that grief. I know that some of us are still stuck in feeling like we want to be the soccer mom and have to grieve the loss that's not what is happening in our homes. So it is important to grieve that. But I really want you to know that self-care is not selfish. It's actually critical for survival. We have to model it. We have to teach it, especially for these kids, right? Because they have not been properly cared for, so they don't know how to care for others or themselves. So it has to be scaffolded. And so we have to walk them through that care for themselves and teach self-soothing and self-regulation, but we can't do that until we can do that with ourselves. We have to have all these things, the equipment, the training, the team, the break, the support, and just that acknowledgement of I need help, being able to ask for help. So I'm going to end here with some resources. I want to talk really quickly about these tools to consider. If you are a therapeutic parent, you will want to find resources, a therapist, an agency that uses these techniques, these frameworks, these models. And I know that sometimes that can be hard to find, but if you're a therapist, I would really encourage you to become educated on these models so that you can use them for children who have experienced trauma. There are many books out there. I'm going to list books. That may feel overwhelming, so just start with one or just seek out help from one. But these are tools and frameworks to consider that really are attachment focused and focused on therapeutic parenting and therapeutic interventions. So we have a podcast at the Attachment Trauma Network that discusses all of this, that gives tips and strategies and resources and provides support. So it is another tool that will help you along this journey. And then here are some suggested resources. This is by no means a complete list. I would like to update it with some new books that have come out this year that I have not added on to this yet, including Dr. Mona Delahook's new Brain Body Parenting. I would put that top of the list. And the book by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah about what has happened to you. These are excellent new books that are not on the list yet that will really be important for anyone along this journey. I'm going to also give you some suggestions for trauma-sensitive children's books because they can be very powerful in helping children heal. There's also a new book that I haven't added to this list that just came out this week called, what's the name? I just had it. Hello, Anger by Jessica Sinarski. It's just a real way to hold space with feelings that these children have and to take the shame out of the behaviors and let them know that these feelings are normal and here's what works to help alleviate them and modulate them. So children's book suggestions. I want you to know that joining the Attachment and Trauma Network is free for caregivers, and we are here to support you and provide resources. And we have a program called R&R for educators that also gives that support. So another resource. It looks like that is the end of my slides. Please reach out to me at that email if you have questions, need resources, and want to continue the conversation. Thank you everyone for listening.